Hello, everybody. As the participants come into the room, I just want to welcome you all to the Center for Ethics and Human Values first of the semester conversation around research ethics. Today, we're going to be talking about thinking about risk to non-participants when it comes to research. And my name is Dana Howard. I am an assistant professor in the Center for Bioethics in the College of Medicine and in the Philosophy Department in the College of Arts and Sciences. And I'm also on the steering committee at the Center for Ethics and Human Values. And it's my deep privilege to introduce you to our esteemed guests today. This is going to be a super interesting conversation. For our external speaker, we have Professor Wikler, who is the Mary B. Saltonstall Professor of Ethics and Population Health in Global Health and Population at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University. Dr. Wikler is a leading expert in ethical issues involving allocations of health resources, as well as health research involving human subjects. He's served as the first staff ethicist to the WHO and has served as a staff philosopher for the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Professor Wikler also is the co-founder and second president of the International Association of Bioethics, and we're just deeply in gratitude for you coming and sharing your wisdom with us today. We also have, for our OSU panelists, we have Professor Alayna Tackett, who's assistant professor in the Division of Medical Oncology at The Ohio State University. Dr. Tackett is a pediatric psychologist and a member of the Cancer Control Program at OSU CCC James at the Center for Tobacco Research. Dr. Tackett examines the respiratory and health effects associated with tobacco and e-cigarette use among youth and young adults, including secondhand smoke. Thank you for joining us, Alayna. And we also have Katie Walton, who's an associate professor in psychology at the Neissanger Center at OSU Medical Center. Dr. Walton's research and clinical interests lie in the area of autism spectrum disorder and early social communication development. Her research focuses on the development, delivery, and evaluation of interventions for building early social communication skills in individuals with ASD. And so just sort of to give everybody a lay of the land of what we're going to do, Professor Wikler is going to speak first, just sort of to frame the discussion and think about the sort of ethical issues related both to thinking about risk and also to how to actually govern those sorts of questions. Then I'm going to open the floor to Alayna and Katie to respond, given from your own experience as researchers. How have you been thinking about risk, and how have you been thinking about risk not only to your potential participants, but to others related to your research? Then I have a few set questions that we're going to sort of discuss, but this really is a conversation for everybody. So in the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and throughout the discussion, there should be definitely enough time for us to get to a lot of audience questions as well. And I just should say before we get started that we're grateful at the Center for Ethics and Human Values for the support from the College of Medicine, College of Public Health, and CCTS in particular. All right, Dr. Wikler, with that, it's all yours. How should we think of risk?
Okay, I'm just going to introduce the subject and put out some questions that I hope we can have a discussion about. It's easy to think of instances in which people who are not enrolled as human subjects in an experiment are nevertheless at risk. I imagine every one of us saw Oppenheimer this summer, and I forget which of the people was assigned to calculate the probability that the atomic test that they were doing, which was research, would explode the atmosphere and kill absolutely every living being. Well, okay, that's non-subjects, and they were at risk. We were all at risk. The heavy duty there. another instance, there's now the possibility of releasing huge numbers of mosquitoes that it's hoped would start interbreeding with the mosquitoes that carry the Zika and other viruses. And if the experiment runs the way they hope, the fertility of the mosquitoes that carry the nasty bugs would be sharply curtailed, and this might be a way of preventing just a gigantic number of terrible infections, very painful diseases. And of course, you want it to succeed. The question is, what else does it do? And what bad things can happen? And the people who live in the areas where these things are being released, many of them are quite nervous. Now, in one instance, the people who were going to do the trial did some polls, and they found that the people in the immediate vicinity didn't like the idea of this experiment proceeding because they felt personally vulnerable. But the people who were a little further away, they loved it because they didn't perceive themselves as being a risk. And so you just have a straightforward conflict of interest among communities. I'll just throw out one more example. When I was at WHO, it was a really dicey ethical issue. There was intense interest in coming up with microbicides for that would prevent AIDS infection, and there were different approaches to it. So the standard thing was to provide a means for introducing the microbicide into the vaginal area, and then watch and see what happens. Now, the investigators felt a strong obligation to explain to the participants, who were the women, what safe sex was and all the precautions that they really should be very carefully taking to make sure that they didn't get infected. And that, of course, included condoms and thinking 10 times before you had sex with somebody. So they felt that they were under an obligation to sort of go overboard and provide an education for their subjects to reduce the number of infections to the absolute minimum. And every infection would mean a lapse in discipline. It would mean that the subject didn't do something that she could have done and should have done. But the nasty secret was that unless there were some infections, the whole thing would be a waste of time. Because the question, of course, was whether the women who got the microbicide infected fewer people or got infected. There was less transmission of the disease than the controls. And so, after you did all the things you did to try to make sure everyone's protected, then you waited around to watch for the ones who it turned out that wasn't sufficient for. Were they ever warned? Nope. So people were holding their breath, and this is not something anyone want to talk about. So, and we could come up with lots and lots more examples. So, just the scariest one of all, of course, is the one from Oppenheimer. But in studies large and small, whether they're involved environmental interventions or clinical interventions, there are lots and lots of people who are not human subjects who are exposed to risk in trials. And what about them? Now, that's given that we know that there are some people and that the risk can often be substantial, sometimes life or death. If those of us who are concerned about the ethics of research with human subjects understandably have an impulse to look for ways to protect people from these risks, especially, you might say, because the ones who are not human subjects are not given any voice in the matter, are not given the right to veto their participation through the mechanism of informed consent the way that human subjects are. So it seems especially incumbent, especially important for those who are sort of the ethical ethical protectors of people who are involved as subjects in human research to keep an eye out for the non-subjects and make sure that they too, maybe even more so, shouldn't be exposed to risk. So if we feel an impulse to go out there and do something and make sure that doesn't happen, that's completely understandable. Now, nevertheless, I'm gonna argue for the other side, which, given everything I've just said, may seem very odd. And it would be odd, except for one thing, which is that I think this debate is only partly about whether these people deserve protection. It's also a question of what is the IRB for. So it may be that they deserve protection and that we should look for ways to protect them, but maybe that shouldn't come from the IRB. In fact, I've been part of a group that's proposed a non-IRB approach to this, which we can discuss later on in the hour if we want to. So what's wrong with going at it through the IRB? Basically, it's this. Let me go back some years. When I was just starting out, which is before many of you were born, I was new on. My first job was at the University of Wisconsin, and the IRBs were just getting going back then. And when I got there, I came in as an assistant professor, as I guess Dana is now, and partly in the philosophy department and partly in the medical school. So the scientists there didn't quite know what to make of these IRBs, and they didn't know what to make of me. They were trying to figure out, what's his agenda? And for the most part, it was a circle the wagons thing. I think our committee was called the Committee for Protection of Human Subjects, and they called it the Committee for the Prevention of Research. And the question for them was, how could they limit the damage that they were sure we were going to do for obscure reasons? I mean, were we right to lifers, or were we some kind of religious nuts, or somehow we were anti-science, and they had to protect this noble enterprise of science from the barbarians that managed to creep into the IRB. And I think of myself, I mean, my father was a lifelong researcher with human subjects sometimes, and I think of myself as strongly inclined to believe in the nobility and importance of research. So if anything, my peers, people who did the kind of work I did, sort of think of me as being on the far side of the pro-research side of the spectrum. So that was an odd thing to be regarded with such heavy suspicion. But it was valuable to me because I did see their point of view. I saw that their fear that well-meaning people who considered that they were meant to protect the innocent might rush in and stop important research from happening, and the immediate beneficiaries might be the people who they consider to be at risk. And what's the price to be paid? Well, those unnamed, uncounted people in the future who might benefit from having more, if we had more knowledge about things. So they're not very tangible. And why not say, no, you can't do this here because look, these people would be hurt. And so yes, you can't do some research. It closes off an interesting approach to some subject that actually might in the future turn out to be very important for our well-being, but all that's very vague. So they were worried that even if you think that these new research ethics zealots were pure of heart, their lack of vision wouldn't give sufficient weight to the importance of maintaining science as a going enterprise. Now, I think actually that concern is a valid one, and we should worry about that a lot. If we look at the sort of what the impact of human subjects committees has been in the research enterprise in America, there was a long period of mission creep and of sort of unchallenged influence and committees throwing their weight around, that almost certainly went too far. There's so many stories that people have come up with about, I mean, I'll just give you a personal one. My son-in-law is an ethnomusicologist, and what he wanted to do was to go to Buenos Aires and interview these aging tango music players. And then he was writing a thesis about, the role of tango music in Argentine politics, I think it was. He was held up for 8 months at Columbia. Now, you scratch your head and you wonder, how could that happen? But listen, stories like that are just routine. They're all over the place. Committees were just butting their nose into everybody's business, and they had no real methods for assessing risk in these kinds of situations. But somebody in the committee had to be in their bonnet, and in many committees, group process took over. And if there was one person who said that they were nervous about a study, well, they wanted unanimity, so everyone would feel good about it. So one person could hold up a study like this, and this was by no means anomalous, and that was really, really bad. Now, fortunately, there was this major reconsideration by OHRP where they thought, okay, let's do a restart. And initially, their restart went even further down that road, but the reaction was so fierce from academia that they pulled back, and now it's much better. Certainly, I see it. I've been on these committees for 40 years now, and I think things are running much more smoothly than they were. That's good, but that period of overreach tells us that the IRB, if you don't watch them, they'll, there's nothing stopping them from sticking their nose into everything, thinking they know about things, and slinging their weight around when they really, they don't know what they're doing, and it's they cause a lot of problems for a lot of people. Now, the thing about the IRB system that I think is part of the cause for concern here is IRBs have to be kind of unchallengeable. It's, we don't have a system of a hierarchical IRB so that if an investigator is shut down or denied something, they can appeal to a higher level IRB. The IRB is it. And you certainly can't go to the dean. If I can be indiscreet for a moment, I'll just tell you, when I was at WHO, the IRB, I've turned out, as soon as I got there, I saw the internal IRB was a total shambles. And I could tell you stories you would be hair raising. So I teamed up with a scientist there, and we got the leadership to bring in an outside panel to evaluate the IRBs, and they found that it was insupportable, and we were just very lucky that there hadn't been a study that blew up, because if a journalist had come in and found out what our so-called ethical review looked like, that would have been horrible for the reputation of the organization. All right, so that meant a rebuild, and they built a very good one. Now, as they were doing the rebuild, the director general called me in and asked for advice on how to set it up. And I gave it. And then she said, now, I just want to make one thing clear, which is that if we set up this powerful IRB that you're talking about, if the scientist finds that the IRB is obstructing at a good study, and they don't like what the IRB is saying, then I get to overrule them, right? Because I'm director general. And I said, no, I'm sorry, that's not the way it goes. Because if we had that, we wouldn't. That's it's supposed to be an ethical judgment. And you have all kinds of incentives to let studies go through, and that can't be the way it functions. If it has any credibility, the buck's got to stop with the IRB. And I explained that there was no hierarchy, and all right. So, she with grave reservation, she backed down and accepted that. But that's the system we have now. I don't think there's any way around that. I think the IRBs have to have the final say. It's an ethical judgment that we make as a group, and we just it's not always going to be right, but we have to leave it there. All right, but that creates, of course, the terrible possibility that when they go wrong, they can go really wrong, and if they're sticking their nose into matters in which they really shouldn't be saying anything, then we should be worried about that. Okay, but now let me come to my main point. So those are some concerns about overreach and so on. But the main thing is this. I think that IRBs exist for one main reason. Now, not all of my peers will agree with this. Maybe some of you, my fellow panelists here, will tell me I'm full of it, but this is what I might consider judgment. If we look back over the history of human subjects research, really, the root story is what happened in the World War II era. What the world knows about, to the extent the world knows about this at all, is what the treatment of the human subjects that were in the Nazi concentration camps by these Dr. Mengele and the other war criminals. But similar things were happening in occupied China at the hands of the Japanese biowarfare scientists. This was the low point in human subjects research in all of history, and barbaric and horrible things were done. Now, when we look at what they did, I think it's useful to say that the scientists who were engaged in this research, as with almost all scientists involved in human subjects research, should be thought of as having two missions. One mission, of course, is doing good science and learning something by using humans as experimental subjects. But there's also, if they're doctors, they have a Hippocratic obligation to see to the well-being of their patients. And even if they're not doctors, then they have a humanitarian obligation to do something like that. And so if we can portray the failure of some ethical standards that took place in these horrible experiments in the World War II period as a time when the one mission, the scientific mission, completely overrode the other one. There was a total failure of the task of managing these missions, which is inevitable. It comes up in research. There's no way to eliminate it, but the task of ethical researcher is to figure out how to achieve the optimal balance or an acceptable balance between these two. Now, given that we know that horrible things have happened with research for human subjects, we institute this very unusual requirement of prior review before you can, put your hands on a subject or entreat anyone to get involved in a research project with you. You have to get the permission of an ethics board. And, there are lots of things we do that affect other people where we don't have to get prior permission. I think is if we harm somebody and, they have some rights not to be harmed, they'll sue us. So that's what we usually do. If it's bad enough, the state will punish us. But there's no general mechanism where we have to ask permission from some ethics board before we engage in something in an activity that has a possibility of putting someone else at risk. But in human subjects research in the medical sphere, we do, and I think it's because of the special history and the fact that without this kind of oversight, the system failed, and so we place this requirement of prior review in there. Now, if you take a long view, you might say that this mechanism has worked very, very well. Dr. Mengele has not come back, thank God, and nothing like that surfaces as in the news, except in the rarest occasions. So, although there's a heavy price to be paid, both financially and in terms of hobbling the research enterprise, there's a high price to be paid for instituting this requirement of prior review. If when we remember how bad it can be without it, maybe it's all worthwhile. Now, that's to say that this is to say that that's what that committee is for. That's very different from saying that the IRB is a committee to make sure that bad things don't happen. So let me contrast these two. The mission that I see is that the committee is there to oversee the management of the scientific and therapeutic or humanitarian mission, which is a dilemma that every research investigator has to achieve. That's what they're there for. And so that's one particular wrong. The mismanagement of that balance is one particular wrong, and the IRB is there to make sure that it's done properly. But there are lots and lots of bad things happening all over the time, all over the place. Some involve human subjects, some don't involve human subjects. And we don't have a committee for protection, for prevention of bad things to happen. And for good reason. And now bad things do happen, and there are solutions for that. Usually it's lawsuits and so on, but we don't have the requirement of prior review. Now, the thing about these bystanders that makes it, I think, sort of intellectually difficult for us to get a handle on is that they sort of resemble human subjects. For example, in our microbicide studies, it'd be sexual partners of people who are human subjects. So what's the difference between them and the ones who we enroll as subjects and get informed consent from? Well, they're the same people in the same community. So and they're all at risk. And so why would we draw a distinction between them? So there, it seems that if we are going to, the IRB is going to be vigilant about protecting the people who are enrolled as human subjects. Why shouldn't they be at least somewhat vigilant about these other people? Okay, that's fine. But actually, let's keep in mind that if we're talking about bystanders of research with human subjects, what is that research with human subjects part doing there? There's a research project, and there's some people who are put at risk who are not human subjects. Why limit our concern to research with that happen to have some human subjects? Any research project at all, whether it's in the chemistry department or whatever, could put bystanders at risk in the sense that some people could be negatively affected by the research, either in its operations because there's some hazard, or as a result of the information coming out that they're seeking, it disadvantage people. Maybe you belong to a group that thinks that your ancestors actually came from the soil of the Grand Canyon, and that's why you have property rights there, and research that would show that actually they were the descendants of people who immigrated from East Asia would not be convenient for you. Okay, so you might say this would be highly disadvantageous to us if this truth came out, even if it's a truth. Okay, well, do we want to say that everybody who'd be negatively affected is of such concern to us that we think that we should require prior review of any research that would turn up this kind of knowledge? So let me just come to an end here with this harangue. To summarize a bunch of points, there's a price to be paid for insisting on prior review. I hope that the price has been, what we've gotten from it has been worth it. What is it we've gotten? Well, we haven't had a repeat of those horrors that happened in World War II and so on. And the public has some assurance that if they sign up as human subjects, there will be somebody looking out for them, and they won't be treated, without due regard for their interests and so on. That's all great. But if we say that non-subjects should also be pulled into this mechanism, there's really no reason why we should be limiting the IRB system to research with human subjects. Then it's the research of any kind, and the committee really becomes a committee to prevent bad things from happening. And we should be very, very cautious before we institute such a committee.
Thank you, Dan, for those thought-provoking and really the great overview of the way in which we're thinking about what the actual mission of the IRB is. This is just an opportunity for, maybe we'll start with Alayna and then we'll go to Katie to just sort of introduce your own research and how you've been thinking about the risks to non-participants as researchers, and if there are any challenges that as researchers you've really had to grapple with in the course of your practice.
Great. So thanks for having me. My name's Alayna Tackett. I work at the Center for Tobacco Research. So I conduct what's called tobacco regulatory science, which is the scientific discipline that supports the evaluation of risks and benefits of tobacco regulatory decisions, right? We also think about public health benefit, like net benefit, harm continuation, or harm reduction on a continuum. And so, yeah, so these are questions that we're thinking about, right, when we're examining, a lot of my work is in e-cigarettes, and so understanding how different product characteristics, different additives impact, the health effects or toxic exposure to users. I've also done some work on secondhand exposure among caregivers who use cigarettes or use e-cigarettes, and what that exposure looks like in terms of nicotine exposure to their children, and thinking about ways to reduce secondhand exposure to smoke or e-cigarette aerosols. So that's kind of broadly in the context of ways in which I've been thinking about these types of things. But I'll let Katie introduce herself, and then we can jump into things.
Hi, I'm Katie Walton. I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm an associate professor at the Nisager Center, which is a Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. So as Deanna mentioned in my introduction, my research is actually primarily in early intervention for autistic children. And it is a surprise to me as much as anyone else that I'm suddenly in the world of bioethics in the last couple of years. And I will say that it is people who at no point were participants in my research that ever pulled me into this field of thinking about bioethics. And that as an early intervention researcher, when I entered this field 15 or so years ago, it was quite clear to myself and everyone around me that obviously the goal of early autism intervention was to cure autism. No duh. The point was to make kids not autistic anymore. And that has shifted hugely in the last 15 years, with autistic advocates coming to us and saying, I'm actually just fine the way I am. The problem is that the rest of you can't wrap your head around a different way of being. And so the rise of what's called the neurodiversity movement, and this idea that we should be thinking about autism and other neurological differences as a valuable aspect of human diversity and not just as a disease to be cured, has really pulled me into thinking about what are the implications of providing early childhood interventions, genetic research, all of these pieces to a whole world of autistic people who are telling us that they have no desire to be different than they are, and that we shouldn't be foisting that on little children either. So that's sort of the frame for what pulled me into this and has me interested in this topic.
Thank you so much. And so I'm going to just jump into, I think, 3 questions that are going to just sort of develop some of the themes that I've already heard spoken about. One is the sort of question about how should we even think about harm and risk? The other question is sort of thinking more about who should we be thinking about and concerned with? And the third is more the sort of governance question about like, what should we do about it if we're already thinking about it? So let's start with the first question. Already we've heard a lot of different potential kinds of harms, including physical harms when it comes to secondhand smoke, but there was also sort of the legal harms that came with, and political harms that came with the Havusapai tribe, and thinking about sort of how research can affect people's claim rights to lands. And then there's the harms of stigmatization that Katie has sort of started to discuss. So these are all these different kinds of harms. So how do you think about harms in your research, right? What kinds of harms are really salient to you and are really challenging for you when you're thinking about research design, populations, and like what sorts of questions you even want to study? So let's start with Alayna, and then Daniel and Katie, if you want to add on, that would be great.
Yeah. So, I think it's like our job, right? As researchers, and when we're thinking about study design, like at least for me, I always think about public health as a whole, right? Like, is the question I'm asking, and are the things that I'm doing, could they potentially be a net benefit for public health, right? And so, when we're, so I have a study right now where we're looking at synthetic cooling agents added to e-cigarettes, and we're looking at toxic exposure, and how adding this additive impacts appeal and abuse liability of the product. And you know, in thinking about that, right, like these are products that are available on the US market. There are products that people are already using, right? And so in recruiting people who are already using these products in their normal environment, right? That's how I kind of think about the risk benefit, right? They're using these already, but by doing the study and figuring out, you know, if this particular additive increases the risk of this product, then that's like a regulatory action that we can say, hey, you know what? These products maybe shouldn't have these additives in this concentration. So that's one way I kind of think about it, right? And then in terms of like secondhand and thirdhand exposure, which, you know, we haven't really talked about much, I think it's a little, right, there's like indoor air free laws, and there's like the context of the environment. If you live in an apartment and that apartment has rules about tobacco use or nicotine use in that apartment, right? Like, so that I think gets a little bit more complicated, whereas kind of more actual kind of I'm going to look at this product and see what the harm is, and can we remove that harm to better protect public health? I think it's a little more straightforward.
Thank you. Katie or Daniel?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, it's so interesting to hear this from different perspectives, because I think that in the work that I do, I think of harms in this wholly different way. And I often think about layers of harm where, you know, we have harms directly to the people involved in our research that are pretty clearly regulated by the IRB, right? But mostly in a pretty immediate type of sense. So when I'm thinking about early interventions, right, it's, well, is the child going to be distressed by doing this? These are mostly behavioral interventions, probably physical injuries, a really unlikely outcome, these sorts of things. But always really couched when we think about intervention with benefits, right? Very easily as in, well, it might be a bit distressing, but long-term, this is obviously going to be a good thing to be teaching new skills, those sorts of pieces. But then I think there's this next layer that's pretty close in to the child that really we're thinking about, but not regulated around, for example, family, siblings. And, you know, my work is clinical in nature and looking to make clinical recommendations. So it's hard for me to tease apart the clinical and the research clinical landscape. But for example, I've had parents whose children were enrolled in high intensity early intervention come to me and say, I've been told I need to do 30 hours a week, but I've got 3 children under the age of 6 who are all autistic. And I just want to take my kids to the zoo. And my clinician's telling me you don't have time for that. You got to spend all your time in therapy. And what does that look like to be a harm to a family system and to opportunities that are sort of typical opportunities for families? And then thinking sort of much farther out, that I think has come into my consciousness much more recently. I've heard autistic advocates describe some autism research as an existential risk to their very being. Right? This idea that the goal of genetic research, of early intervention research, to inherently change their personhood, you know, seeking long-term or medium-term to essentially eliminate the existence of autistic people. And so thinking about, you know, what are the goals of intervention? Is it to help give people their best lives, or is it to turn them into something different that they never were? And I think that's something that's much more on my mind recently, about what are our broad goals and what implications does that have for this child as an adult? Does it have for other autistic people that we're communicating with sort of in the world about their value? And that, you know, I think at an individual level, that if I spend 40 hours a week for 2 years communicating non-verbally to someone, that everything they do and think and the way that they are and their way of being is wrong, how could they possibly come out with their sense of self-esteem intact, even if they're able to talk and make eye contact and not flap their hands when they're feeling anxious? And where are those risks and benefits that are far future and very difficult to predict, but also probably still there?
Well, Katie, a question to have for you is this. Suppose that someone was trying to improve the techniques for the sort of traditional goal of autism research, which is, you know, to make someone act less autistically. And the IRB blocked it, saying that just doing the search itself is going to increase or perpetuate the era in which people are stigmatized, even by those who want to help them, because of this single-minded focus on not being autistic. And so they blocked the research. They said, you can't, this would be, unethical to do. What would you think about that?
Oh, see, this is so challenging because I think the problem is that honestly, I don't think it's necessarily most of the people sitting on the IRB have that expertise. I think that's very true. And frankly, I'm not sure that any of us even steeped in this field actually know where are those harms and benefits. So I think for me, this is more of a problem of the direction of our field in general and the things that we think we know and that we don't know and that we're not asking than the regulation of any one study. And so I sort of agree with you that I'm not sure that the IRB blocking this is the place for it, because I think it would be so idiosyncratic about what studies were decided to be okay and not okay. I think with a place within IRB, as somebody who writes to the IRB all the time, where I do question a little bit how we weigh these things, is that I am allowed to argue all the time about the greater societal benefits to autistic children. And when I write in there that, well, knowledge about this clinical intervention will make life better for autistic children in the future who can access these things, nobody questions me about it. And they just take it at face value because I'm the subject matter expert. So I do wonder whether some of those arguments that we as researchers are being allowed to make about greater societal benefits ought to be scrutinized a little bit more closely in this risk-benefit ratio, because I think sometimes they're overstated. But yeah, I'm not sure the IRB is the place for all of this regulation.
So what you pointed to is the expertise deficit that, the IRBs have people from a variety of fields, so we can't cover everything. And even so, with these days in this era of specialization, we really only know a whole lot about the narrow thing we do. So there's a vast amount of ignorance, relative ignorance on the part of the IRB. Okay, so that's one problem, but there's a even if we could cure that, suppose you had somebody on the IRB who you thought really had mastered this field, and so you trusted their judgments. Still, if they said, look, we're going to block this study because we think that having this kind of study perpetuates the era in which the stigmatization happens, and so we're going to strike one for non-stigmatization by stopping you from doing research on how to seem less autistic. Okay, now you're not going to challenge their knowledge of anything because they may have the facts. But what would you challenge their prerogative of blocking the research for that reason, that they say, we're not going to let you do this piece of research, which is just trying to do your job better. That's all. We're not going to let you do that because the cumulative effect of this kind of thing is in our view negative.
So I struggle with this because, like, emotional reaction, like, yeah, I'd definitely be mad about it and I'd want to defend my study, right? But then I think about this in the context of, if we really are trying to push this idea that this is a valuable type of human diversity, would I have a problem with an IRB blocking a study of conversion therapy for LGBT people? Because they're saying, well, these people want to be converted and we're going to test whether it makes their life better in the long run to do conversion therapy.
Great analogy,
and this is a common parallel. And I would be like, well, yeah, of course you should block that study because it's horrible, right? Like, our scientific community has agreed it's horrible. So I think that the challenge here is when you have a moving target about what the broad goals and ethics are around a piece, it's really much harder to draw those lines. And I think a lot of autistic advocates actually draw that parallel frequently between LGBT, lesbian, gay conversion therapy and the push to mask autistic characteristics.
Yeah.
So I struggle, like, emotionally, I would want to defend my study, but then I think about the parallels and I'm not sure I'm in the right.
May I ask just sort of a follow-up to Alayna about this? Because I mean, so it doesn't seem like there are parallels, but I think there are potential parallels with the in the public health realm when it comes to research related to e-cigarettes.
Yep.
It does seem like some people worry about certain research programs more broadly into to think about what are the downstream social effects of like normalizing e-cigarettes, like, you know, and sort of thinking about the ways in which there could be public health consequences for studies to be had that are not directly related to even the sort of second and third hand smoke, like sort of people in the environment. Have you thought about that, or is that something that you've been worried about as a researcher, or?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'd have to say the tobacco industry does a pretty good job marketing their product themselves. So it's the normalization, you know, I think on the whole isn't coming from public health, you know, research in general. But I would say that, you know, thinking about your question, right? I think this is something that I talk to colleagues with all the time, right? Because I think sometimes people want a straightforward answer, right? Like e-cigarettes are bad, and it's such a nuanced answer that it depends on what population you're talking about. Are you talking about adult smokers who want to quit, who have tried a bunch of ways to quit and haven't found anything effective? And this group of adults are like, hey, this has been like a great thing for me, right? And then if you're talking about 13-year-old adolescent who's never had a tobacco product in their life, right? Like, yes, they should not be using e-cigarettes. E-cigarettes are not appropriate in that context, right? So yeah, I think it's been a real struggle of trying to communicate not necessarily the research, but the message behind the research, right? Like, you know, alternatives to combustible tobacco, right? Well, it's not FDA authorized to be as a cessation tool, but a lot of people, you know, the broader community has been like, hey, I found this is the only way I ever quit smoking. This is really effective for me. And so a lot of research has now kind of focused on how do we make these, is there a way we can regulate these products in a way in which it's appealing and useful for adult users, but it's aversive for young users who have never used a combustible product and have never used nicotine. So that's where I really had a lot of, I don't know, you know, introspection or trying to think about the messaging, especially working with young people, right? Is like, you know, we don't want young people using these. We don't want young people developing lifelong nicotine dependence, but is there a world in which these products could be less harmful and expose users to less toxicants and a beneficial way for adult smokers to quit smoking? I think there is, right? So yes, the message it's complicated, and nobody likes a complicated answer.
But I think it's a really good example of the kind of challenge that comes up when people want to use the IRB for protecting non-subjects. And let me go on a little about this just for a moment. Let's take let's suppose that I were a big backer of harm reduction in tobacco harm reduction, which is an embattled point of view these days in the United States and Australia and a few other places. From this point of view, there's been a kind of national hysteria about e-cigs, about nicotine addiction. You know, nicotine doesn't kill anyone, doesn't cause cancer. It's horribly addictive, but the health effects are not apparently not that drastic. Whereas smoking combustible cigarettes kills 1 out of every 2 customers eventually, which is, you know, pretty high mortality rate for a consumer product. So it's what's from the harm reduction point of view, there's something really strange about the American debate where there's hysteria about teens becoming nicotine addicts. You know, understandable that, you know, it's not a good thing. But so what the result of that is people want to completely ban the e-cig, which may be the only way of preventing half of these confirmed cigarette smokers from dying of the thing. So how can you even think that these are remotely comparable? So but the fact is that, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Average American, they see their teenagers suddenly become addicted to nicotine, they go berserk, and they put heavy pressure on their political representatives who find that if they stand up and say they're going to make sure that this never happens, we're going to ban those goddamn e-cigs, then they get votes. All right. So now, from this perspective, you could just easily imagine an IRB trying to butt its way in and saying, we got to protect these kids. But it's a moral mistake to do that. It's a moral tunnel vision, because they're just seem oblivious to the mortality risk facing adult smokers. And you have to be able to improve and promote e-cigs to save these people. So it would be a situation where you have this, you might say, sort of market failure in American politics, where the politicians are responsive only to the suburban parents who are concerned about their kids, and not even looking at the smokers tend to be from disadvantaged populations who aren't, don't have much say. And so this distortion is finding its way into the way we regulate ourselves, certainly. Now, if an IRB just went with the prevailing winds, then they would block all these studies as something that could be a life-saving thing, and it's the last thing we want to happen. So that's an example of what something bad that might happen if we opened up the IRB remit to non-subjects.
So before we jump into the IRB purview question, I do want to think a little bit more about the population that we're studying, and how should we think about who is a bystander of research? Is it everybody? Is it specific people that are close to the research participants that we should be focused on? Is it special communities?
Yeah, the answer is yes.
Yes. Okay. So
all of the above. Look, research can
above.
affect everybody. It can affect, like we saw from Oppenheimer, right? It can affect every living being, or it could just affect somebody who's interacting on a very personal, intimate level with someone who's a human subject. So yes, everybody is a bystander potentially.
So if everybody's a bystander, how should researchers think about it, right? Like, do researchers have special obligations to particular others that aren't that aren't actually potential participants, like the children or sexual partners of the research participants? Do they have a special status, or is it just everybody that is a bystander? It's the same as basically, nuclear bomb trials. Like, we're all affected by the ramifications of research. Maybe I'll ask Katie and then Alayna if there are particular populations that you really care about when you're thinking about this sort of bystander question, or it's everybody that you could potentially be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Dan that ultimately it's everybody, but I'm not sure it's everybody equally, at least in the type of work that I do, right? I certainly think that I'm thinking, for example, about immediate family members very quickly. And maybe that's because some of the work I do is in parent training, working with siblings, to the question in the Q&A, right? About being a sibling who has been pulled into your child's clinical treatment, it sounds like in that case, as opposed to a research study necessarily. And sometimes you're enrolling those people directly in research, but sometimes you're not enrolling them per se, but you know that the outcome of the research could have a really direct, meaningful, acute impact on them. And so, I don't know, I think from my perspective, there is sort of a greater obligation to think of that as a fairly immediate harm. And that then perhaps this circle of additional people, in the person's life, for example, or maybe that special population of other autistic people might be farther out. And, the whole world and the way we think about ourselves, right, is this very far out piece. And I think part of that for me is because I feel like as a researcher who's doing a defined study, because I think this is one of the things I'm thinking about as we're talking, right, is that we're now talking about banning a whole category of studies about a topic as opposed to vetting a particular study. And I think the ability to predict potential harms of a particular study feels easier, right? And I think being able to predict potential harms of a study to, for example, the child's family and immediate people in their life seems much more reasonable to predict with some accuracy compared to the universe of autistic people who we know aren't going to all be thinking the same, or the universe of people out there in the world. So I guess I think of it as circles, with that closest circle maybe being my strongest concern, but also thinking at a more philosophical, programmatic level about some of those wider areas.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about a clinical trial I worked on in grad school where we were using like novel oral products to get adult smokers to kind of switch to those to reduce secondhand exposure for other kids, right? So like in that instance, that's clearly the parents signed up for the study, but we have their kids in there, and the kids didn't, you know, they're not signing a consent form because we're not asking them to do anything as part of the research study. There is a net benefit there potentially, right? We reduce their exposure, they're exposed to less, you know, smoke, nicotine, you know, whatever. But thinking about it in the like the bystander, right? Like what in that, like Katie's saying, right? Thinking about specific studies is easier to think about than thinking about it in the, it gets overwhelming if we're like, okay, well, what about this and this? But in that instance, for that study, right, would we have the kids fill out the, like, sign the consent? Would we enroll the parent? What if the other parent didn't know that they were using these products? I mean, you know, I work with youth and young adults now, and you know, when I was doing my postdoctoral work, like I was recruiting youth e-cigarette users, and in my informed consent, I had that the parent sign. I said, we will not disclose to you whether your child is using or not, right? One, because we need to develop that sense of trust with the adolescent, that they knew that we weren't going to disclose their user status, so that they could talk to us honestly about like why they're using, you know, what choices they're making. So, you know, when we think about bystander harm, right, like how do you, I think about the consent process and all the things that go into it. And then are you disclosing someone's medical history or whatever you're doing as part of protecting that bystander group? And in that case, then does that do more harm than good? You know what I mean? Like, so I think there's a lot of different, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's just kind of the things that I'm thinking about.
One thing that I'm hearing from both of you is that part of thinking about the potential special communities that are also like rethinking what benefit means. So it's like, you know, who stands to benefit? It may be this sort of generalizable knowledge, but there also may be certain like specific people that are directly benefiting from whatever the intervention you're testing, which that's another sort of way of thinking about it, at least. So let me now jump into the question about, you know, governance. I think that, Dan, you've really made a very compelling case why the IRB may not be the appropriate overseer of thinking through these ethical issues. So is there a way to have either ethical guidance or ethical oversight that, are there any sticks or carrots that we can actually implement to try and ensure that at least the more direct bystanders are being taken into account when it comes to the ethical design of research?
If I can, I have a ready-made product here to display. So a group of us published an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that suggested the following, that at least with NIH grants and maybe big foundation grants, that researchers who are engaged in research that could affect people who aren't research subjects, and these might be studies that do have human subjects, or it might be studies that don't. But you know, where bystanders could be affected negatively by research, that they be invited to fill out a section of the in the application process that would first of all ask them to make an effort to identify these people and to make an initial estimate of possible risks and the extent of damage and so on, and then to if there is a possibility of some serious problems, to justify why they think that it's okay to proceed with the study, even though these people might actually be disadvantaged by it. And then those who are deciding who gets the grants should, you know, make a point of reading this, and they might they might decide that not to approve a study because they didn't like how these people handled this question in their application. So it's not the IRB at this point, it's the funder. Now, that means that the funders have to have some ethical perspective. But they make big time ethical judgments all the time in just deciding what priorities to have. Like, for example, Katie, in your field, should they, if some agency has been funding autism research, should they now turn their back on ways to help the autistic seem less autistic and only talk about how to enhance the self-esteem of people who are obviously probably going to be autistic. That's an ethical question as well as a therapeutic question, obviously. And so this wouldn't be new kind of a assignment to give them. It's just asking them to take their obligations to sharpen their ethical lens a bit, make that maybe a more conscious goal. So it's taking the mission that you're talking about, Dana, and looking around to see, okay, who else could take this on if we don't want the IRB to do this. And one advantage of this is that it gets past I think a very difficult problem for people who think the IRB should do it, which is it seems totally arbitrary to limit this kind of concern to studies that happen to have human subjects. I mean, why do that? What's the point? And here we don't have that issue. You're muted.
I'm mute. So now we're sort of moving into questions from the audience, and Donal Omathuna had a question that I think is a useful sort of piggyback of what you were just talking about, Dan. So, so one of the things that Donal says in the question is that part of what IRBs do is provide an external perspective on the project. Maybe the researchers didn't think about some aspects like the harms to non-participants. If not the IRB, where could the ethical evaluation occur? It seems like then one of the things that you added was like, well, there is the scientific review when it comes to funding research. So that's one level of like potential external review. And so this is sort of welcoming to Daniel or to Alayna or Katie. Are there other expert like sort of parties that it would be great to have like as an external perspective on some of these issues if we could figure out which of the sort of research studies could trigger some sort of review? I don't know if you've thought about it, but besides
well, just think about it. Part of it is let's go back in history a little bit. Henry Beecher was this Harvard professor who wrote a very influential article in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that a whole long list of research studies that had been published in eminent journals had pretty clearly cut corners with the protection of human subjects, and that was really amazing and helped launch the whole current era in human subjects review. But Beecher was opposed to IRBs. He thought that these were very serious issues, and the way to address it was in the education of doctors, in the education of investigators. So just as we have these misconduct training now, similarly, he thought there should be training in human subjects research. So that's one place, is in training. Another one is just encouraging more symposia, panels, and other events within a field. I mean, Katie, I assume that in autism research, these questions about whether or not the neurodiversity perspective should be given pride of place, or whether it's these are misguided people or whatever, there should be lots and lots of panels about this. And so then researchers, investigators would go into these panels and having to think about it there, and then that would influence what kind of research that they would do. And maybe that's how to do it. And Alayna, certainly with the harm reduction, there needs to be more of that. Yeah,
I agree, Dan, with several things you said. I think that big funders like NIH, NSF, they have the infrastructure to put these things in place. They already have your subject matter reviewers in place. So it feels like a very reasonable place to start. Although I think my concern with starting and stopping it there is your comment about training. That, when we think about socialization into research and expectations for research, a lot of that happens at the training level. And at least in my field, the number of trainees who are getting their training research funded by a major federal funder is very, very small, right? And so I think that we need to be thinking about that potentially as an infrastructure that we can then create tools and procedures that we could move down. So maybe it's, the NIH has this form and infrastructure, and my university is going to say, that's also part of your thesis proposal, whether you're NIH funded or not. But somebody else has done the work to create some of that infrastructure and create some ideas about how to review. So I really sort of like that model that could be moved across multiple places. The other place that I think that you sort of alluded to as well, that journals have a real place to play here, I think. When I see, for example, the evolution of expectations for review and meta-analysis articles in the last 10 years or so across fields, and you can't get a review published in at least my subfield anymore that hasn't used Prisma guidelines. Right? There are several set of published guidelines that high-tier, at least good quality journals are making authors use. And so now our students who are doing reviews in their third year of graduate school are knowing that they need to follow these guidelines if they want to have any chance to publish in a decent outlet, even down the road. And so I think that, much more research is published than is federally funded. So I think there's a role for publishers to be pushing people to these standards as well.
So there's
that's sort of putting the emphasis on the role of the consumer of information. If to my mind, the biggest impetus for improved research ethics practices has been the FDA and other national regulatory authorities saying we're not going to look at data that you submit if it was improperly obtained. Well, that tells the people who are producing the data that tells them what they got to do. And boy, they're very interested in that.
I would like to add, so Jan Weissenberger made a comment rather than a question, but I'm going to turn it into a question. So Jan mentioned sort of the question of exposure to hazards. So if the research involves biohazards or radiation, most universities require approval by an institutional biosafety committee, which could explicitly address the potential hazards to researchers and general public. This does not address the other questions raised by the panel. It seems like part of what we've talked about with the harm and the to whom is who's a bystander is we're thinking about this sort of potential relationships between the researchers and the participants, and then the sort of relationships between the participants and family members or children. But maybe we should think about certain hazards, like predictable hazards, right? Like within different contexts of different, within autism research or within sort of harm reduction research, there are potential hazards that are predictable in a systemic way. And I'm wondering what you think about this sort of idea of locating some of these predictable public hazards and taking, I don't know, if that's something that's come up in your research, or if that's something that you think would potentially be a useful way to have an external check on the kinds of research that is being conducted. And this is for anyone. This is just sort of a little bit of trying to brainstorm on the spot.
Well, we have the animal safety, the committees. Animals are, I guess they are research subjects, okay, but they're not human research subjects. Mm-hmm. And so we've decided collectively as a society, I guess, that guinea pigs deserve good treatment too. And so we extend this special concern for them. And it's another hurdle for scientists to go through. Initially, it was resisted like hell from a lot of scientists, and now some of them have taken this on. And I know that in the early days of that, one thing I found it amazing is that the people who were fiercely opposed to having any kind of ethical oversight about the treatment of animals, they just didn't want to talk about whether there was whether it was wrong to make animals feel terrible. They didn't. It's just they wouldn't talk about it. Now, however, some of them not only talk about it, but they actually write articles about it. So they've taken this on as something that they should be concerned about, which is great. Okay, so that's that's a committee where we identified one source of suffering that for non-human subjects, and we decided we were concerned about it. We put in we have this mechanism that seems to be working well. So if we can maybe with radiation hazards, people who know enough about radiation, they know a lot of things that the rest of us have no idea of, and it's essential that they get their vote in there. And so those are all fine. It's just the general license to prevent bad things. That's what I'm concerned about.
So there's about 5 minutes left, and I do want to give each of you just sort of one more round of bringing up any points that you either want to emphasize as like takeaways or anything that hasn't been mentioned yet that you think would be really important as a takeaway. So Dan, I'm going to give you the last word, and why don't we start with Katie and then Alayna, and then you could go at the end.
Yeah, I really appreciated this discussion. And I think one thing I want to add that really hasn't come up as an option, at least in my field, for how we think about this, is soliciting the opinions of the impacted parties. That, the use of community advisory boards, advisory committees, thinking about talking to autistic people and people with other disabilities, as well as their family members and others, about the permissibility of particular types of research, about the direction of research, and about what work we should be doing, has been something that I think has become of growing importance, at least in my subfield. And I think it's not limited to that subfield. We can think about, who are those most affected parties, and making sure that we are, particularly if they are a disenfranchised group historically, bringing those perspectives in as one element of how we are evaluating the direction of research that we're doing, and trying to do research that does more good than it does harm. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with Katie. I think it's such an important aspect that hasn't always been utilized. So I know a lot of my colleagues, and we've considered doing things like a youth advisory panel, right? Like getting youth and young adult voices as part of understanding, right, what matters to them, right? What are they seeing? And young people, particularly with like tobacco and substance use in general, right? A lot of times, my participants I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I haven't seen that device. And they're like, oh yeah, this is this new e-cigarette. It has this in it and it's this flavor. So I learned from them too. So yeah, Katie's 100% right. Like thinking about incorporating other voices, getting other people's opinions, I think is really important. I think us as researchers, right? Like we should be thinking about these things. We should be having these types of conversations. So I really appreciate you bringing us all together to have that conversation and start generating that, because, I think it's easy to get siloed in your own zone, and you're not thinking about other things if you're not exposed to those ideas.
I agree with everything that you're saying, and I agree that those community boards can be invaluable and maybe should be mandatory sometimes. It's really hard to be an ethical scientist is the main thing. Part of this conversation has been about what the mechanism of the IRB should be about, and as I've said many times, I'm nervous about them having too broad a mandate, but that doesn't mean that I think that the concern for non-subjects isn't something that every researcher whose work would affect people shouldn't think a lot about. I think of a couple of my colleagues who they've just produced one superb study after another of the functioning of the U.S. non-healthcare system, and they got some real zingers that have influenced events. And I once said to them, look, you do these meticulous studies that involve years because you have a good nose for problems in the system, but doesn't it happen sometimes when you collect the data, it turns out you're wrong, and that when if you publish the data you had, it would actually support some of the practices that you abhor? They said, of course. I said, what do you do then? They said, we don't publish it. Now, I've told that story to colleagues. I get a variety of reactions, as you can imagine. Some think it's intellectually dishonest. But other people say, look, they're engaged in research because they want to improve the world, and their first question before they publish something is, will this improve the world? Whether the study is correct is one question, but the main question is, will it improve the world? So in a way, they're looking at the effect on bystanders before deciding whether to publish. And they may have stuff that would burnish their credentials tremendously because they very did meticulous research and would be published in a very good journal. But they decide, forget all that because it doesn't protect the right bystanders, so to speak. Now, I think I think these people are great. Actually, it's not that I applaud suppression of evidence, but what I like about them is that they're always ethical. They're always thinking about priorities, and researchers should always be thinking about what is the effect of doing what I do. I mean, you can get rewarded for all kinds of research that's going to really be harmful, because maybe just here's a case. Every industry that produces stuff that harms people has they pay scientists who can publish articles that sort of confound the opposition. So there was a tremendous interest on the part of the tobacco industry when they found out that people who take care of pigeons can get lung cancer somehow from the pigeon droppings. So there was all this money for pigeon dropping research. There was a recent case where there was a demand by nutritionists that fast food outlets put calorie counts up by the prices, and a guy who's a well-regarded scientist was hired by the industry to place an article that cast doubt on whether or not that would actually deter overeating. Now, in these cases, the companies that are commissioning research, they want it to be the highest quality research possible. They want everything to be true that's put there. But what they also hope is that by placing this accurate, well done piece of research into the literature, it will get in the way of reform and allow them to keep selling their harmful products. Okay, now suppose you're a researcher and your money is waved in front of you. If you'll publish this thing on pigeon droppings, or the article casting doubt on the beneficial effects of calorie counts, will give you a whole lot of money. What do? Well, if you're an ethical researcher, you say, no, I'm not going to do that, because you understand what the game is. You're not naive, and your integrity is being bought, essentially. Not your scientific integrity, because everything you can back up everything you're saying. It's just that you know where this is coming from. All right, so one thing, we just hope that researchers, everybody goes into science, because if we think of science as in the noblest terms, it's a humanistic activity done for our mutual benefit. We hope that every scientist will be encouraged to be autonomous, thoughtful, on the lookout for the ethics, and weighing everything all the time and deciding how to behave in every respect. And that includes protection of bystanders. If you're going to do something that's going to hurt a lot of bystanders and there's nothing comparable of the value that will come from it, then of course you shouldn't do it. And the more we can put the emphasis on autonomous, imaginative ethics on the part of every researcher, well, that's how we come out ahead.
I just want to thank the three of you for really having a conversation, opening up a lot of questions, but I think also providing some ways of thinking about this, both from a regulatory perspective, but really from a personal perspective of researchers themselves. So thank you for the audience for joining. And next month, actually in about 2 weeks, we're going to be having another CARE panel on thinking about representation in research and medical and research mistrust, and how to have sort of inclusive recruitment practices. So I hope you join as well. Thank you.